Donc, je vais inviter notre conférencière Jessica McCarty. Jessica, c'est à l'Université de Miami, pas le Miami en Floride, mais le Miami Ohio. Ouais. Et aussi avec NASA. Pour ceux qui suivent Ladies in Landsat et toutes sortes d'autres choses, elle a une carrière très forte en télédétection, dont elle va nous parler de certains travaux. Je ne sais pas si elle va parler des castors, hein, des cartes mondiales qu'elle a fait, les castors de Canada, comment cette espèce envahissante s'est propagée à travers le monde, ou d'autres choses. Elle a aussi été très active ou très vocale au moins pour le pays, pour commencer pour une femme de percer dans un domaine qui était tristement dominé par les hommes. Je pense que ça va être très éducatif et je vous encourage de participer activement à cette conférence. Jessica.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you for inviting me, and I apologize that I have to speak in English now, because I do not know enough French to give this in French. It was a surprise and an honor to be asked to speak today, and I hope that we can have a good discussion. Do you see it? Yes, okay. Aha, and I have a little pointer. Good. Okay. So good morning. So this is me. I'm currently a tenured associate professor at Miami University in Ohio, not Florida. We are named after the Miami tribe. The Miami tribe has their own center of learning and education on our campus, and we integrate their language and their learnings into our curriculum. So it's very nice to work at a university that has a genuine relationship with the peoples that we're named after. So if you know me in real life, they find it really interesting and kind of funny that I'm asked to do a lot of diplomacy, because I'm not a very diplomatic person in real life. But I do this a lot. I somehow am at this intersection of science and policy and diplomacy, so thank you. It's nice to be here as an American in Canada, our strongest and closest ally. At the end of this year, I will actually leave my tenured position, and I will become the branch chief of Biospheric Sciences at NASA Ames Research Center in Mountain View, California. So that's NASA in Silicon Valley. And I'm currently working as an associate program manager for the NASA Wildland Fire Management Program. So we're under NASA Earth. We did not send the little instrument into space to hit an asteroid yesterday. That was NASA Space. So this is part of NASA Earth Science, where our mission is to protect our home planet. I've done a lot of work with NASA. I've been funded by them continuously since 2003. So I'm a science team member of the NASA Land Cover Land Use Change. I've worked in the interdisciplinary research field where we must incorporate humanities and social science with geospatial and ecological science. It is a part of the funding call. I'm also a lead field crews, so we can fly big 747s through smoke plumes. So I'm out there burning grasslands and prescribed fires and forests and agricultural lands, so we can fly these planes through, and that's what FireXAQ was. And then NASA Wildfires is really a global focus, but we particularly are interested in North America, and my field is the Arctic. And here are some examples of work I've done with NASA working with the private sector, where we're trying to make index insurance for smallholder farmers by using petabytes of very high resolution satellite data to map individual fields and then track individual phenological cycles of crops, and sometimes even timber. I've also worked with the US EPA, so I am that link between the ecology, the fire, and the smoke, and I help come up with methodologies for emissions. For the US Department of Agriculture, I work with agronomists and economists, and we figure out ways to communicate with farmers so that they can burn better. They want to be good neighbors, so we're trying to ensure local air quality is improved. And then I've worked in this new and upcoming field of geohealth, where we mix geospatial, ecology, and public health research. And here, I often serve as a consultant for Indigenous-led research in the US and Canada, including most recently for the Spokane tribe in Washington State. Okay, so how do we link science to policy? In my role as a US representative to the Arctic Council working groups, we're really thinking local to supernational. So as you can see, this is when Canada was the chair of Arctic Council, but there are 8 countries in the Arctic Council. Currently, only 7 are cooperating because, as you might imagine, Russia is not playing well, the other 7 countries. And we have 6 permanent Indigenous participants who also lead their own working groups, science and policy initiatives. The group that I'm a part of is AMAP, which is the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. And here we must produce peer-reviewed, rapidly published Western science-based assessments of how the Arctic and the Boreal and any northern temperate ecosystem could impact the Arctic. Right now, the Arctic Council is paused because of the war in Ukraine. But in May of 2023, Norway will resume chairmanship. Each of the 8 countries gets a 2-year chairmanship in order, rotating. And at that point, we will resume some of our work. In the meantime, I can show you what we have been working on as we try to continue our work through this international crisis. So for one, I led the effort to link this idea of short-lived climate forcers, or short-lived climate pollutants. So these are things like black carbon, methane, to field ecology. So they were working with meteorologists who monitor smoke and air quality from fires, potentially emissions, but from really large-scale global climate models. And when I joined the group, I said we absolutely have to think about what is happening on the ground. What is burning? What are the soil types? What are the forest types? What are the ecosystems? Who is burning? And when? And for what reason? And that led to this summary of policymakers, which is available in all the formal languages of the Arctic Council. And we actually talk about how fire management and land management must be integrated into air quality and climate change management, because they actually hadn't thought about that. They were really just thinking about climate models. I like to think of fire as this whole picture, right? So if you don't know the landscape, then you can't know the fuels. If you don't know the fire weather, then you have no idea how climate change is impacting it. And of course, while smoke is our product, you have to know the ignition source as well. I just happen to come at this from a satellite perspective, because I love satellite data. So one of the reasons we study Arctic fire is that we know that climate change is bringing extreme fires to the Arctic, mainly right now, as we can see, in Siberia, though there have been some in the North Slope of Alaska in the last 10 years. And why we care about this is that we know large-scale fires, both at the surface and canopy, can occur in the Boreal. But what we're seeing is an extended fire season into the Arctic, even above the tree line, and in fuels that have not really been mapped or categorized. So we have very little idea what's the ignition, what is burning, and why it is burning. We also know that our vegetation is drying out, so this is a flammability buildup index. This was done by the University of Alaska Fairbanks as part of the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration report card for the Arctic. But researchers like Mike Flanagan, who's now at Thompson River University, do a similar thing through the Canada Wildfire Partnership. And as you can see, even by June, we're seeing flammability at the extremes of the tree line, across the Pan-Arctic and Boreal, but even above it. And this is not expected, right? June is kind of the beginning of summer. We would expect this later. We also know that our global emissions, so think of all these models that are reported to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or at the different COP meetings or the climate meetings, the Conference of Parties, that they're often based on satellite data. But they have to use emission factors and fuel loading, so vegetation biomass conditions, from peer-reviewed literature. And there's a complete lack of boreal and Arctic emission factors and fuel loadings globally. We don't really know them. We use them based on expert knowledge, but we haven't produced them. During the NASA NOAA FireXAQ field campaign, which I was a part of, we actually sampled fuels in these areas. But the farthest north we went was southern British Columbia. Recently, some researchers from Environment and Climate Change Canada have published some work here around Fort McMurray. But as you can see, it was actually kind of just this serendipity event. They were there to sample the emissions from different gas refineries, from fracking and different natural gas extraction. And it just so happened that a wildfire plume went through their flight plan. But they weren't there just to sample the smoke. So we're going to have to start thinking about how to coordinate and get a better idea of what's happening in our northern forests and our northern ecosystems. This is a good way to think about a fire regime. So an individual fire is something that occurs, right, in a short time frame. It's the flame itself, and it needs oxygen and heat and fuel. The fire behavior is dependent on the landscape, so you must know everything about the vegetation and the topography. And the fire regime itself then takes this information and you build on the vegetation and the different ignitions and the climate change over time to make a fire regime. And why this is important is that when we calculate fire emissions, similarly, we need to know all these things to get here. So if you want accurate fire emissions and climate estimates, you must know the forest ecology, the land management, the fuels, the climate, just to quantify individual quantity, transport, and rate. So before the war in Ukraine started, we went ahead and we published our work with AMAP as a peer-reviewed paper here in the European Biogeosciences journal. And because this occurred in 2021, we do have some colleagues from Siberia who were able to participate, who are amazing fire and forest ecologists and modelers. And unfortunately, we haven't heard from them since March. So we don't know how they're doing. We wish them the best. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that if I read more than 300 papers on boreal and Arctic fires in English and in Russian, what we find are that we see basically a mirror image of Earth. Right? So we know that increased lightning is occurring, particularly in Alaska. This is starting to be witnessed in the Russian Far East. We know that there is a transition from boreal to grasslands, similarly over here from forest steppe to steppe. We know that agriculture is already starting to expand north. In Siberia, they're growing corn at 70 degrees north because some of the interior microclimates are warm enough, and also because we've hybridized seeds so you can grow corn in 60 days. So, GMOs for the win, I guess. Here, boreal tundra zone is turning into dry peat. Same is happening throughout both eastern and western Siberia. And in eastern North America, we are seeing this coniferous to deciduous, and that will decrease fire risk. And we see that too in some of the Nordic countries. But in the Nordic countries, they drained most of their peat in the early 20th century and have yet to assess the fire risk from that. I'll come back to that to show you a big example from Finland. In North America, we've, though not been great at peatland management, we have done better and tried to re-wet and preserve some of our wetlands, and that will serve us well into the future. Our long-term emissions are going up. Since the mid-2000s, there's more fires occurring above 60 degrees north than in the temperate zone. We would expect more fires in the temperate zone, right? And that includes California. So I know that we always have California in the news, but we're actually seeing more fires in the northern landscapes. And this is witnessed in 3 different emissions models, and then also just from the MODIS active fire counts. We also know that fire emissions are really important. For example, in extreme fire years like 2020, they outpace all black carbon. So this is the dark part of soot that you can see in smoke. It's a component of particulate matter 2.5. That wildfire is the main source at both 65 and 60 degrees, even outpacing natural gas extraction and flaring. So fires can have a really big impact locally on the climate as well. And why do we care about black carbon? Is that when it deposits on ice, right, it's the albedo effect. It makes the ice melt sooner. So early season wildfires are making our sea ice and our glaciers and our ice sheets melt even sooner, while climate change is kind of warming them from the bottom. We also know that the geographical sources of black carbon emissions and the Boreal and the Arctic are mainly in Asia. And in fact, basically it's Siberia. 68% of all Arctic fire activity, so above 60 degrees north, occurs in Siberia. Which means, as we like to say, Russia is not only the Arctic. There are bigger parts, right? There are other countries who are part of the Arctic. But we can't solve this without them. Right now, that is a non-starter. We won't be able to engage them. That's just where we are internationally. But in the future, potentially science diplomacy will need to be used because their emissions have to go down for the pan-boreal and the pan-Arctic to be sustainable. So I know it's a tough pill to swallow, but it's the reality. Even in the Boreal and the Arctic, people are the main ignition sources. So in Alaska, the largest fires are started by lightning strikes, but more than 3/4 of fires are started by humans. Yes, so it's a good thing to remember. We can prevent these fires. I don't want to be Smokey the Bear up here, but we can prevent fires. Humans are part of the solution. So let's look at some examples. This is work I've done with my colleagues at Greenpeace Russia, many of whom have left the country, been told to leave the country, and most are safely out, not all of them. So they're no longer in Russia. We did this work, we published it in December of 2021, right before the war starts. I need to say that because under sanctions, I'm not allowed to work with Russian scientists, as I know is the same case for Canadian scientists. Why do we map spring fires in Russia? Well, one is that under their federal laws, implemented by the Duma, the parliament in Moscow, there is no federal agency that monitors springtime fires. They assume wildfires start in the middle of June, and before that, those fires don't exist. So they don't track them. There are no official statistics, and only places like Greenpeace Russia are monitoring them. So these are orphans. If you calculate just the spring fires that occur in Russia, outside of, we did not include above 65 degrees north, so we didn't get northern Sakha or Krasnoyarsk, places like that. This is 10 times, this is more than 10 times what we see in an extreme year in California. So this is a huge amount of burning that is completely undocumented in current emissions models. And what's really important to understand is that all this burning that you see here across regions, it's not in any of the UN FCCC reporting, the IPCC reports, it's not part of the COP negotiations, it's not in those media sources when Russia argues that their boreal forests are a huge carbon sink and not a source. They're not including any of these fires. So it is unlikely the boreal region of Eurasia will ever be a carbon sink because they're burning too much of it. What's really important too to understand is that agricultural lands are not the only source of burning. For a long time we thought that this was the case. Between the years of 2008 and 2014, I would spend between 2 to 3 months a year in Russia doing field work, coordinating projects, mapping these fires. What we have found is that really we're talking about unmanaged forests because these have been abandoned lands that occurred at the end of perestroika, so the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Forestry practices were abandoned throughout much of European Russia and even into southern Siberia. So no one is managing these forests. No one is harvesting them. No one cares what comes of them. But if someone burns them, the owners don't have to pay taxes. So you have a perverse incentive to burn unmanaged forests. So again, forestry and land management and ecology will be part of the solution here once, if engagement can begin again. Why would a place like the Arctic Council care about this? Well, if you're doing negotiations of pollution across 8, now 7 countries, you want to know where your sources are. And what we have found through some very interesting field campaigns, stretching from Boreal in the early 1990s to Arctas in the early 2000s, is we know that fires throughout the northern temperate, the boreal, and the Arctic ecosystems, they matter to air pollution and black carbon deposition in the Arctic. And in fact, as southern as 40 degrees north can be a fire source for smoke transport to the Arctic. So I know that means your bonfires, if they're large enough, could potentially, they just have to be really big bonfires to transport to the Arctic. But forest fires in southern Quebec could be impacting the Arctic if done at the right time of year, normally spring, early summer, and if the stratospheric winds are in the right direction. So this means agriculturalists, the wheat growers in the prairie provinces, they need to be careful. Within the northern US, the same thing. This is not just a Boreal and Arctic problem, it's a shared Arctic space. So we have to be better stewards of our fire practices. The North American fire science community has a lot of lessons to share with our Nordic partners. This spring, I spent 3 months in Finland on a research exchange on a European Commission and Arctic Council project. And part of that was to help Finland and some of our Nordic partners start building their fire science groups. They're really strong in forestry science, as you know. We were thinking about what could they do for fire science. So I always tell them to go to Canada Wildfire. This is an amazing group. I mean, I love their webinars. They have YouTube videos, podcasts. They're really on it. They're on the cutting edge. And it's just a great bunch of scientists as well. So here's an example from Finland. So this is Colloque, Finland, which translates to fish river in Finnish. This is a wildfire that occurs in a very hot and dry summer. They had another very hot and dry summer this year, but thankfully no large fires. So what happens here? Well, it burns for about 227 hectares, and they know that this is from Pelastusopisto, which is the group, it's a firefighting group, that does all response to emergencies, including wildfire in Finland. They find that this was caused by an industrial source. So it was actually a welder putting in wind turbines for wind energy, causing a wildfire. I know it's like irony upon, so The Simpsons wrote it or something, but this is what happened. There was a wind turbine being put in, the peat was very dry, and the welder, this ignition set the ground on fire, and the forest was dry enough to burn as well. So this is the extent. We can actually map it with Sentinel-2, pretty close to what the actual was, a little over, but it's good enough. It's good enough for government work, right? So we have at 10 meters, this is really the resolution of satellite data that we can use for boreal fires in the Nordic. My colleague, Tuomas Ahkala at the University of Eastern Finland, he has been working with some of Pelastusopisto contractors to think about what is happening here. And one of the things that he found was that basically all peat has been drained in Finland, except in national parks. And it was for industrial timber. And the contractors who were putting in these wind turbines were not able to read maps. What do we mean by that? All of these blue lines are drained peat. Those are actual canals in which they drained the peat and the water was moved. And this green area is the burned area. So here's an initial fire site when they were putting in a wind turbine that caused a fire, and they put it out. But then they ignored that and went ahead and started doing it over here. so then they started a larger fire. These renewable energy contractors did not know that this map meant drained peat. So when they proposed these sites, they were proposing to light fire on dry peat, and because they couldn't read the map. So this is a real issue. And this is from the Finnish National Land Survey. It's free and open source data. This is a communication issue, right? Talk about science, policy, corporate partnerships. That should have happened. I will say, just one thing to know is that the technician who started this fire was actually tried and convicted in court in Finland this summer. And I did not respond to a request for an interview from a Finnish journalist, but I will say this publicly because I said it on background, I think that that's a bad precedent. You don't want to be convicting and fining potentially people facing prison sentences for accidental fires, because they're not likely then to report it when it happens. So I think that they've set themselves up for potentially a very bad precedent. Okay, so Tuomas and I kind of came to this conclusion when we started talking about it. It's not that the Finnish government, the research institutes, the practitioners on the ground, they understand that climate change is happening. They can see it. It's just that they haven't put these two things together. Climate has changed and the landscape has changed too. And as both are continuing to change, so the fire activity and the fire emissions are changing. And so we need to understand both in order to prevent these type of accidental wildfires. Another colleague of mine, Juha Aalto at the Finnish Meteorological Institute, led a really wonderful project report about the history and future of wildfire for all of Finnoscandia, so all the Nordic countries plus part of Murmansk, Russia. And here, Heinrich Lindberg, who is a really sweet and just brilliant scientist, he came up with some very interesting arguments that I think are wrong. So he says, because it's an industrial forest landscape, I think that you will agree in your experience in forestry here, that perhaps these aren't the best ways to prevent fire. He argues that massive clear-cutting will prevent fire, that pine-dominated will result in low-intensity ground fires, that commercial thinning will reduce ground fires, that mosaics of even-age stands will prevent fires, and that rapidly developing the forest road network, that the roads themselves will prevent fires. And I argue that no, that is not the case. Finland does not read as a low fire risk. In fact, the road networks are not sufficient to stop these fires. They're very narrow roads, they're single lane. Even among a mosaic of timber stand, a canopy fire would very easily, even a surface fire, would jump these roads. But they're thinking the roads will save them. The roads themselves are ignition sources. 90% of their fires are started by humans. The more humans there are, the more fires there are. And not all forest roads are created equal. Some of these, to call them roads is being very kind, right? So, so they're definitely not fire breaks in any sense of meaning. And even stand ages set you up for invasive bug kill, right? For rapid death from blight or disease. So then you can have huge fire risks across large stands. And so I think that they need to think outside. My challenge to them has been to think outside the commercial timber box, right? To read their landscape. What if this were a natural landscape? Would you consider this low fire risk? We'll see. One thing to know is that the Finnish forests are owned and operated by a company called Metsähallitus. Metsä means forest, hallitus means government. So they're partially owned by the Finnish government. So this will be something that will take a long time for them to fix, because it is this kind of public-private ownership of the forest and a negotiation across government. One of the things we want to do in the Arctic Council and in our working groups is to respect and incorporate Indigenous burn practices in our Western science-based models of management. So in our AMAP, our Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program working groups, we will often consult with our Indigenous permanent participants. We call them the PPs. But if they're not comfortable incorporating the data, we don't do it. Right? So we just do it based on what Western science will tell us. And then they lead their own projects on fire or climate adaptation or sustainable development. So one of the things we wanted to talk about in our review paper and in our soon-to-be-released report is that, and this was a message that the Europeans needed to hear. North Americans were on the same page. But they needed to hear that fire is not bad, that there is good fire. So one of the things that I showed, and this is an example from the Sami in Sweden, who are traditionally reindeer herders. They are the indigenous peoples to Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and parts of Western Russia, that they know that in the short term, a very large fire will destroy their lichen pastures, and that decreases them. But over the long term, if they have small fires, it will maybe prevent them from using one pasture 1 year, but it will keep those pastures open so that there's more reindeer. It's better foraging for them. And in fact, some sociological research done in Sweden by a PhD student shows that the Sami understand that. They know that while it may destroy the lichen pastures temporarily, this maintains the viability over a long term, and that's what they want. They want a continuous long-term viability. It also tends to prevent ice damage to lichen. Ice is a big concern for lichen pastures with climate change. Too much ice means the reindeer can't eat, and they starve. So we're seeing a pattern where places that have been prescribed burn are less likely. The lichens seem to be more vigorous, and they tend to have better canopies that prevent the ice damage. Some of our partners in Alaska and the Northwest Territories here, Edward Alexander and Devlin Fernandez, who are the chair and the co-chair, respectively, of the Gwich'in Council International, have been leading some projects with the Arctic Council to try to document and then share indigenous knowledge on cultural burning in the Boreal and Arctic. And one of the things that they know is that if you have early season burns, they're pretty small because the snow's still there. Right? You're probably not going to go to the canopy. It's too wet. And that increases caribou and moose. If you have late season burns, those fires are really big. And then that tends to destroy the ecosystem for several years. It takes a long time at these latitudes, right, for the regeneration of the vegetation. So then you get less caribou and you get less moose. And that's a problem because many of the Gwich'in still rely on wild food sources to make it through the winter. So this is really about food security, right, and livelihoods, and not just maintaining an ecosystem. So if we come back to thinking about why we should care about linking all this knowledge we have about our landscape and our cultural systems, to understanding climate impacts of fire, what our AMAP group, our expert group on short-lived climate forcers, is going to tackle the next time is that we want to think about and highlight how this lack of indigenous and local knowledge on fires and fire emissions is really, lowering, right, devaluing our current understanding of short-lived climate forces and black carbon deposition. Because we know that fires are a source, some of the governments have said maybe we should just ban all human-caused prescribed burning in the spring. Well, that's not the right policy. So what we want to do is to use our science to show that, or to test, we don't know, but is transport possible from these low-energy surface fires, from early cultural burning? I'm not sure. I doubt it. They're probably too low energy. But even if they are, they're still preventing huge fires that have more deposition. So we want to come at this from a scientific perspective so that we can prevent bad policy, like those kind of knee-jerk reactions, instant reactions. So fire is bad. And where we can, we want to advocate for co-production and funding of indigenous scientists and communities. Some of the Arctic Council working groups must use co-production with the permanent participants. AMAP isn't, because we must do rapid peer-reviewed published reports. But we still think that this is important, and we want to be able to compare our results with the co-produced science so that at the end, the policymakers can see the benefits of both. All right. That means it's an all-hands-on-deck situation, right? So we have to have good science, good policy, good management in order to protect our future boreal and Arctic ecosystems and to thrive with fire. We're not saying fire is bad. Some fire is bad, some fire is good. All of North America is a fire-adapted ecosystem, so we need to learn to live with them. So what can be managed? We can manage our fuels. We can't prevent lightning. There's no managing lightning, right? So we need to think more about our peat and our permafrost and what grows on those things. So how to manage our forests, our grasslands, our tundra, our steppe. People with an emphasis on those who live there. The Arctic is the most indigenous place in the world, right? So we need local leadership there. We have to understand timber, energy, and tourism causes. I don't know if you know this, but there were 2 wildfires in Greenland in 2017 and 2019. Raise your hand if you knew there were wildfires in Greenland. Yes, and they were less than 70 kilometers from the ice sheet. So welcome to the things that keep me up at night. Both were caused by tourists, by hikers. Yes, not putting their campfires out because they didn't have to previously, right? The landscape was cold and wet enough that you didn't need to worry about it. That's not the case anymore. Right? So you must be a good steward of the land. We have to understand how cultural and prescribed burning can actually make for a better future. Right? We can't remove fire from situations, just like we can't really remove timber, energy, and tourism, whether that energy is renewable, right, renewable in Finland's case or not. We need energy. There are these zombie fires, these overwintering fires, and peat, and deep peat that we need to be concerned about. In Alaska and the Northwest Territories, there are 2 ongoing campaigns, one led by a Canadian research chair and one led by a U.S. The director of the Institute of Alpine and Arctic Research at CU Boulder, but they're working together, trying to figure out, how many of these fires are happening. Because if we're burning our peat, it's ancient carbon being consumed and being emitted. This is happening a lot in Siberia, and I know from my Greenpeace Russian colleagues that it seems to be increasing. But to be quite frank, that data is not going to be available to us for quite some time. So we need to understand North America, and then we can work later. And then Arctic wildland firefighting, policy, and infrastructure cannot match what's done in the Boreal. The Arctic systems are too fragile. Right? If you disturb permafrost, you've caused it to degrade, it will fall. So what we do in the Boreal and our northern temperate forests for wildland firefighting, that doesn't work in the Arctic. So we need to become more creative. And we need to prepare and predict the future. That means better understanding of modeling uncertainties. All the modelers in the room, we need to think about how are our emission models performing. We need to actually put in the uncertainty of our inventories. I'm always shocked when people publish papers and never even thought about that the inventories themselves are uncertain. They're uncertain, so let's talk about that. We need to do better fire behavior modeling, understand our atmospheric processes. They are changing too, just as our landscape is changing. And that temperature is important, right? So you could have a hot, dry summer. That's really important. But if you don't have an ignition and you don't have the right fuels, you don't have fire. So we need to start thinking about modeling those as well. And that means, and this is kind of our challenge, that everyone across many disciplines, we need a human, climate, atmosphere, and landscape model. That's a lot of models put together, but that's what we need. We need to understand human populations, the climate, the atmosphere, and of course, the ecology, the forestry, and the landscape that's present. All right, so that's kind of my wrap up for science, and then I said I would talk about diversity. We call it diversity, equity, inclusion in the US. I think here it's called inclusion, diversity, and equity. But let's talk about it, okay? Let's just be a very congenial discussion. So here are some closing thoughts. One, there are other people whose voices are more important than mine. Right? But just before we start, know that if you're here in the room, that you belong. Right? So everyone belongs in science. Every child is born a natural scientist. They wonder about the world. They want to know how it works. Right? So everyone belongs. This seems very impressive, I know, right? But this is just my work life, right? Like, this is me. So I'm from Appalachia. You've met a hillbilly. You can tell somebody that. I grew up poor. It was really common where I'm from, so it wasn't like, I didn't feel picked on or unique. It's just that everybody was poor. So that's just what we were. At 17, I have wonderful parents, but they have no money. So I've been on my own since I was 17. It's tough. When I'm home in Kentucky, so I grew up on a farm on top of a mountain in the middle of a national forest in a very old traditional way, raising our food and hunting our food and fishing for it. And I was told to lose my accent if I wanted to be taken seriously. I'm sure some of you have felt that as well. At the first NASA meeting I went to as a graduate student, and I should say that my master's and PhD advisors are the founding fathers of remote sensing. And yet someone made fun of me because the only clothes I could afford were my church clothes. And so they thought I looked silly in my fancy church dress. Right? That's not a good way to make someone feel like they belong. At a previous job, the women I worked for decided that our casual Friday needed a dress code because when they got to wear tank tops and jeans on Friday, that it looked inappropriate on me and that I needed to have a dress code. So I will say that the men I worked with were fantastic and made fun of them relentlessly until they dropped to this dress code idea. Right? But that's not okay. I was working with a group of geologists. I was told to hide my pregnancy. I don't know if you know geologists, but they're mainly dudes. So they were like, you shouldn't talk about it. Hide it as long as you can. And since I've been 5 years old, I've been told to be more ladylike. And even more recently, in my tenure decision, one of my colleagues said that my personality was more appropriate if I was a man. Just not a very collegial thing to say. Right? So this is, if you know me, and some of you do know me, on Twitter, or we've been around, I am, yes, Dr. Jessica is very impressive, but Jessica is just white trash, this is just me. And I don't think I have to hide that, and I know it makes other people uncomfortable, but whatever, everyone belongs in science. So because we are ecologists, landscape people, I like to think of diversity and equity and inclusion as slope stability. So it's a slope stability model approach, all right? At no fault of your own, some people are born with a stable slope for a career. It's not your fault. None of us gets to choose who we're born to, where we're born, when we're born, right? And so you have a stable slope. And science is hard. We're all trying to make it up that slope, right? Everybody's working really hard. Some of us are not born with a stable slope. Right? So we have this unstable slope. We have rocks falling down. There's slumps occurring. Some of it's just slow slide. Right? And so what we really need, and what we want to focus our diversity and equity and inclusion work on, is stabilizing other people's slopes. That's it. We're just asking you and me, I'm asking myself to stabilize other people's slopes because they want equal footing. That's it. The aim is equal footing. I don't know why this can make people mad to talk about it. The world does not treat everyone the same. Okay. But the more people we have in the room and the more backgrounds that they're from, the better. Because that gives us better solutions in science. So you need to know thyself. This is sometimes called the academic wheel of privilege. Many of my graduate students, my postdocs, my researchers, they come from outside the US, and English is not their first language. And one of the things that I've learned is that because English is my mother tongue, that I have this privilege that I didn't even like consider. But it is, like, English is the lingua franca of science. It won't always be, who knows? But I can just choose to pick whatever second or third language I want to learn. I don't have to worry about English. So what does mine look like? Kind of all over the place. I look like a really strange car, I guess. So it's almost like a weird map of the United States now that I look at it. But if I were to say what's my privilege, I have some that's very close, right? Where the center you have the most and the outside you have the least. But I have some in the middle, I have some on the outside. When I accepted this talk, I have a small child, and I needed to negotiate childcare because my husband works full time, and we live very far from our families. So when I travel, he becomes the primary caretaker, and when I'm there, I'm basically the primary. He's very, very engaged, but you know, young children, 9 out of 10 times, pick their mom to be the primary caretaker, and that's a reality for many heterosexual couples. And so I have to do this negotiation. I can't just say yes. I have to be like, let me get back to you. I need to figure this out. So it was around my daughter's birthday, so I'm having to throw her 2 birthday parties. This is my penance from coming. But it's fine. I'm looking forward to the Ninja Warrior party and the Princess Tea party. But I think that this is a good relationship. I actually get this from a colleague of mine at Esri, Dawn Wright, who'll be the first African-American to dive into the Marianas Trench in the submarine. She's super cool. She's a very, very wonderful lady. And I think that if we just look at ourselves this way, it's good. Like, I started out at the lowest rung of socioeconomic status in the U.S., and I am now pretty solidly middle class. So I keep with me poverty brain, as we like to call it in English, but I'm not right now, you know, and I own my home and things like this. This is the privilege we want to think about. And you want to help form communities. And to the leaders out there, our admins, our deans, our directors, our professors, sometimes that means forming communities and you stepping away. The community is not for you. I have a lot of friends who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and transgender, and they sometimes include me and their community. And when I'm there in their space as someone who is heterosexual, straight, it is my role to listen and support them and love them and comfort them. It's not my role to talk, right? To talk over them, to tell them what to do, to tell them how the world is treating them. It is just to be there as family, right? So I'm part of the family. But they have their own community, and when I'm invited, it's an honor to go. Maybe that's a good way to think about. You form your own community, you help others form communities, because humans are social animals. And I guess this is probably like my Southern evangelical background, but just have and give some grace. You will make a mistake, you will need people to forgive you. Other people will make mistakes. You will need to work to forgive them too. Right. And I'm not talking about the worst actors. Lord knows there are some people who deserve to be canceled. But most people do not. Right? So let us show some grace as we learn and work towards real inclusion and equity and diversity in science. All right. And kind of like a recovery, I have a couple of close friends who run recovery groups because they themselves are sober. And you have to do the work, right? You fall off the step, fine. Just go back to step 1 and restart. Just keep doing it. Just do the work. That's fine. You might slide down the stairs every so often. You might trip. It doesn't matter. The step is there. Just take a step. Do the work. All right. And with that, I do want to invite everyone who's here and interested in fires. We will be having our second Arctic and Boreal Wildland Fire webinar, co-hosted by my colleague Ville-Veikko Paunu, who's at SUKE, the Finnish Environment Institute, on October 27th. You can register here. And we're featuring a partner from Canada Wildfire at the University of Alberta, actually recommended by Mike Flanagan. So I know some of you also have him as a colleague. I'm looking very much forward to hearing Dr. Jane's talk, where He will be talking about fire and climate from a North American perspective, and then we have he will tag team with a researcher from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And then we have some talks from Finland and Norway as well, more about the atmospheric model. But we welcome you to attend. It's a Teams meeting. Yeah, and with that, just merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions.
I like the idea of the first message, belonging. Anyway, now is the time for questions for Jessica on the first part or the second part of her talk. Ça peut être en français si vous êtes plus à l'aise.
Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, really interesting. So you made one quick remark which seemed really important, the perverse incentives for people to light fires in this region where there's a ton of fires that go undocumented. What?
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate?
Sure. So the Russian law is that if your land is burned, it's considered damage to your property and you don't have to pay income taxes. And so this is actually a response, if you remember, those of us who are older, there was a huge fire outside of Moscow in 2010 that killed 35,000 people from smoke impacts. And part of that response was to try to create laws that would disincentivize burning near large cities. And so one of the things they put into place was that so many people's property and dachas, summer cottages, were burned that they didn't have anything left. And so the Duma said, okay, well, if something is burned from a fire, you don't have to pay taxes, just rebuild. Well, now that's used as a way to just avoid paying taxes. And so people will hire someone, oftentimes they'll say, like, in Russian they'll say hoodlums, like, and I don't think they mean that, but they mean like they may give someone money to just casually throw matches as they're walking, down the yes, and so they don't have to pay. And this law just has never been revoked or fixed, and so there is an incentive to burn your land in the spring because taxes are due in Russia in the summer, like at the end of the summer, so you can just prove, damage. This happens in Greece and Spain and Portugal too because of where there have been large wildfires. I think that Europe hasn't perhaps come to terms with the fire future that we're living in, and so their laws are very much like behind the climate reality of today. And so they're going to have to catch up. Yeah.
Jessica, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for giving me so many reasons not to sleep tonight. You're much better than coffee.
I sleep really well.
That's reassuring.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to ask a question that maybe many students here like me are going to have facing your presentation, is that what can we do at our scale? I mean, we already feel, I imagine, a student pretty far away from policies in our own countries. And now we see that, some countries like Russia, on the other side of the world, has such an impact. What would you recommend at our scale to communicate, to engage with policymakers? It's kind of, we have so many issues already, so it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing is not to bite off more than you can chew, right, so to speak. So, but I actually have hope when I think about, ironically, renewable energy, not the Colloque fire example, but 15 years ago, renewable energy was very much like a climate activist pipe dream, right? It wasn't really going to happen, but people kept working on the edges. And now in most countries, it's more than 20% of energy. Even in the US, like coal is going away, natural gas is being replaced by renewable energy quickly. And I think that we underestimate how much power we have by working on the edges. If you as a student want to start engaging with policymakers, then it behooves you, it's in your benefit to think about, are there established programs where I can spend a summer in Ottawa as a science consultant for a parliament member? Learning the infrastructure of how to get science to policymakers is really important. And there are practitioners and professionals here, I know, they've taken me out to dinner since I've been here, who can tell you their response to working with provincial level, policymakers. And, often it's, this really is kind of like a test of wills. You just cannot give up, So I think trying to position yourself into an internship, a short-term contract, or even a career where you will be the scientist talking to policymakers is really helpful. How I got into it was that, it's wild, but I did my PhD research where I was the first person to map all human-caused fire in the US, and so with satellite data, and so an NGO, National Non-Governmental Organization, said, will you help our Russian colleagues do this? And I was single at the time. I had a dog. I was like, yeah, sure. Little did I know what I was getting myself into. And it was just that willingness to say yes when many people had turned them down because working in Russia wasn't glamorous or doing field work. I know I don't have to tell you all this. A lot of people hate field work. I love field work, at least for the first 2 days. Then it sucks afterwards. But, we can all be honest, right? Field work sucks. It's just better than sitting in front of a computer, So I do think that there are ways to do this. I think that in Quebec you already have an advantage that you're multilingual. You can speak many languages. That's really important. In the U.S., my generation and younger, most of us are workable in Spanish. We've been learning Spanish since we were children. But our older generations don't, they speak only English, and they're not interested in learning other languages. So it's really important to emphasize those skills. You have very marketable language skills, cultural skills. Do not downplay those soft skills, they matter. Being able to work in other cultures is really important, and being able to respect, those boundaries are important. So, I guess too, I think my maternal grandmother wasn't allowed to go to school and couldn't read or write. And my paternal grandmother died in childbirth. And I'm gonna work for NASA. So I think our past, our ancestors had hard times too. And it's hard for us to know that because we can't live their lives, right? So I think I don't like to use British sayings, but a stiff upper lip would help too. We're going through a hard time. Yeah, that sucks, but let's do it. Let's get, right? The Buddha says the only way out of pain is through it. So let's go through it. Yeah. I still think we have a way to do this. Fire, we can solve. Climate change, we'll have to adapt, right? And I believe that the DEI work, diversity and equity inclusion, is important for that because we need to not just have respect for each other in science, but for the world. Because this is a global issue. We're going to have to care for other people outside of our little, small communities.
I was wondering about the mirror image that showed from the pool. Could you talk a little bit about the realization when that became a realization of what was going on in the mirroring?
Oh, they were mirroring. So what's interesting is that I didn't have that realization because I knew that was going to happen because I had worked in Eurasia and I had worked here in North America. So I was there have been times when I've been in Russia where I'm this could be Alberta, I'm thinking, what is happening? And it's because the landscapes are very much dictated by the latitude. And North America is a big continent, Eurasia is an even bigger continent. So we share species and climates. And in some places, we share indigenous nations, right? So I was expecting that. My European colleagues were not expecting this. And almost thought were convinced we were wrong. And so they went back to check the work, to check the lists, because they just didn't think that Russia could be anything like Europe and North America. And that's a cultural thing for them, right? Well, it must be different. But it's not. we're very similar. The Boreal and the Arctic is very similar. And so I think for the people who had that realization, it was them having to face the fact that like they are not some exceptional place, that the world is more connected. Yeah.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks for your presentation. Maybe a DEI question. There are still a lot of gatekeepers in science at many different levels, at hiring committees, editorial boards of journals. How do you deal with that in your own circles, say? How do you work against that gatekeeping?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm actually like Twitter famous for like pushing against this. I guess some of you might know that. That is like I do not put that on my CV. I'm a little embarrassed that happened, honestly. But, and earlier in my career, I was actually interrupted at a NASA meeting by a young man who told me to read my own paper. And I didn't know what I was talking about. And I had my name tag here, and I was like, I am that person that you're talking about. And to his credit, my program manager, who's also a man, was just glaring at this guy to get him to shut up. So gatekeeping is real. I have the kind of like aggressive personality where I will push back, but I know not everybody likes conflict. Canada. So I would like to say that when you can, please push back in person in real time. But this gatekeeping is real. So one of the reasons NASA recruited me for this position to apply. It was competitive. One of the reasons I was even interested in it was because I wanted to remove the gatekeeper. So many of our branch chiefs, we have 11 NASA research centers. It's still like 90% women. You know, and like, come on, it's 2022. We can hit an asteroid, for God's sake. I think we can hire, some people who are women and not white, So it is serving. Unfortunately, it does mean you have to do some service. Those of you who are in those service positions, you'll have to think about like balance a bit more. And then when you can, build your community and promote each other. So Ladies of Landsat was mentioned. Ladies of Landsat was actually formed by 2 early career scientists because they were taking PhD seminars, one in McGill University and one at Boston University. And for 2 semesters, they read no papers by anyone who wasn't male. So they were like, we want to know about women in remote sensing. So they made their own group. And they've been promoting women across the world. It's not just North America, across the world. It's not just in English. It's, but they had to do that themselves. And now I'm kind of, myself and a few other people, we're afraid they're getting like pigeonholed. That they'll only be asked to do DEI when they themselves are really good scientists. And so we're trying to like peel off some of that work from them so other people can do the work as well. So I do think that, if we can learn anything good from COVID is that sometimes you actually have to work together, right? I'm kind of a misanthrope. I don't like people, but I have to live with them. So I think we need to, for these gatekeeping, we need to make our own communities. We need to promote each other, and when we can, we need to support each other and make sure that voices are elevated and that they're not just put in a corner to do one thing, because everybody is more than just one thing.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you for this open discussion on these issues because they're very real, and it just feels just so great having someone talking about gatekeeping and being minority in science, because even though we are getting forward, we still need to talk about it, and I think that will help just make things better for everyone.
Yeah, thank you, and you're welcome, and really it has been an honor. Some of you know me outside of work, like Jan knows me from Twitter and some stuff. And this is kind of me unvarnished, like there's not another version of me. And I think because my Venn diagram of private life and professional life does not meet. And so I've chosen to keep my private life kind of away, from my professional life. And we shouldn't, I never felt forced, but it was just something I wanted to do. But I've met people who very much felt forced to do so. And I've talked to other people, and it's because they don't feel like they fit, like they're not on the same wavelength as everybody else. And I know we get tired of talking, so I will be quiet soon, but we do actually have to talk about these things sometimes. It doesn't have to be all the time, but we do need to keep having the conversation. And if there are no more other questions, though, I'm really excited about the science and the art that I'm going to see today. I'm also excited to see how well my near fluent Spanish helps me with French. Probably not much, but let's see. But yes, I think because we're almost over time, but I really appreciated this. And I hope next time, I can see someone else give a talk on DEI, and it gives me ideas. And I will be in a supervisory position, hiring people at NASA, mentoring people at NASA, starting careers. And at NASA, we want the best candidate. And we are not allowed to use affirmative action, the US law around consideration of diversity. And yet, NASA is still diversified. So that should tell you something. Like, we need the best candidates. We're a mission critical agency, and we need everyone. So we want everybody, not just the same old people from 1960 who landed Apollo. So that we are a good example of why, as an organization and as a mission, that we need everybody in the room. So again, everyone belongs, and thank you very much.